How did smoke and fire become the unofficial anthem of American summer? Was there a moment when the scent of charcoal and sizzling meat first drifted across a backyard and someone thought, "This is it, this is what summer should smell like"? And how did something that started on Caribbean islands centuries before Columbus ever sailed end up defining patriotic celebrations from coast to coast? The aroma floating through your imagination probably bears little resemblance to the acrid, eye-watering smoke of the original barbacoa. Those Taíno people of the Caribbean used grain with that produced clouds so thick you'd need to stand upwind just to breathe, and their choice of proteins, iguanas, manatees, partially decomposed fish, might make your modern stomach turn. This smoky trail through 5 centuries reveals surprising connections between island preservation techniques and suburban rituals, between enslaved cooks and celebrity pitmasters. As the story unfolds, each revelation might slow your breathing a little more, ease the day's grip on your shoulders, until historical facts feel as soft and drifting as wood smoke itself. Consider subscribing for more journeys through history's unexpected corners. Your presence here in the darkness makes all the difference. Share your oldest barbecue memory below, that first whiff of smoke at a family gathering or local festival. I read these stories when sleep won't come. Settle deeper into your pillows now. Let any lingering light fade. Perhaps crack a window to imagine that first trace of smoke drifting in. You find yourself trying to imagine it. Those first encounters between Spanish explorers and indigenous Caribbean peoples in the 1490s. The Spanish conquistadors, already exhausted from their ocean crossing, stumbling onto beaches where the Taíno had been perfecting their cooking methods for generations. According to the Chronicles of Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, written in 1526, the Spanish were both fascinated and slightly repulsed by what they witnessed. These indigenous peoples had constructed elaborate wooden frameworks, sometimes as large as a small room, suspended over smoldering fires that burned continuously for days. The word itself, barbacoa, comes directly from the Taíno language, though historians continue to debate whether it originally referred to the wooden framework, the cooking method, or possibly even a sleeping platform that doubled as a food preservation system. What we do know from Spanish colonial records is that this wasn't quick grilling as we understand it today. This was an entirely different relationship with fire and time. The Taíno would place whole animals, fish, iguanas, small mammals, even manatees according to some accounts, onto these elevated platforms and let smoke do the slow work of preservation. The Spanish explorers, accustomed to European roasting and boiling methods, found themselves both intrigued and challenged by this technique. Some archaeological evidence suggests that similar smoking methods had developed independently among various indigenous groups throughout the Americas, from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin. But it was the Caribbean encounter that would give the practice its name and launch its journey into global consciousness. What particularly fascinated the Spanish, according to letters sent back to Spain, was how the smoke seemed to transform the meat into something that could last for weeks in tropical heat. This wasn't just cooking, it was a form of primitive refrigeration. The indigenous peoples had discovered that the combination of smoke's antimicrobial properties and slow dehydration could preserve protein in a climate where fresh meat might spoil within hours. You can almost see those first Spanish colonists, sweating in their heavy European clothing, watching with a mixture of hunger and suspicion as the Taíno tended their smoking frames. Some accounts describe how the indigenous cooks would baste the meat with a mixture of cassava juice and hot peppers, creating what might have been the ancestor of all barbecue sauces, though this remains a matter of scholarly speculation. The conquistadors were quick to adopt and adapt this technique. Within a generation, Spanish colonists throughout the Caribbean were building their own barbacoas, modifying them with European ironwork and Spanish spices. Historical records from Hispaniola in the early 1500s describe massive barbacoas being used to smoke enough meat to feed entire expeditions. The Spanish added their own innovations, using the technique for pork, which the Taíno hadn't known before European contact. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn that many casual histories overlook. The Taíno people who created this technique, their population was devastated within decades of European contact. Disease, enslavement, and colonial violence reduced their numbers so drastically that by the mid-1500s, contemporary Spanish accounts were already referring to them in the past tense. Yet their cooking method survived, carried forward by the very people who had destroyed their civilization. I sometimes wonder what they would think, those Taíno cooks, if they could see what became of their barbacoa. Would they recognize it in a Texas brisket or Carolina pulled pork? Probably not. But the essential principle they discovered, that smoke plus time equals transformation, that remains unchanged after 5 centuries. The technique began spreading beyond the Caribbean almost immediately. Spanish sailors carried it to Mexico and Florida. Portuguese traders brought similar methods to Brazil. Each landing point added its own interpretations, its own available meats and woods, its own spice combinations. What started as a practical preservation method on tropical islands was about to begin its transformation into something far more complex. Meanwhile, as Spanish colonists in Florida were teaching this smoking technique to other European settlers, something else was happening that would fundamentally shape barbecue's future. Ships were beginning to arrive from West Africa, their human cargo bringing with them generations of expertise in smoke cooking and spice blending that would soon merge with indigenous and European techniques. The convergence of these 3 culinary traditions, each shaped by its own relationship with fire and flavor, was about to create something entirely new, something that could only have emerged in the complicated cultural landscape of colonial America, where survival often depended on sharing knowledge across boundaries that seemed insurmountable. You're standing in colonial Virginia, sometime in the 1650s, and the air carries a familiar smell that shouldn't exist yet. It's barbecue, but not quite as you know it. The smoke is different. Hickory mixed with oak, and beneath it, something else. Spices you can't quite place. Combinations that haven't been written down in any cookbook because the people perfecting them aren't allowed to write. Evidence from plantation records suggests that by the mid-1600s, a remarkable fusion was taking place in the American colonies, though few contemporary observers understood its significance. Enslaved Africans, forcibly brought from regions with their own ancient traditions of smoke cooking and spice rubbing, were being tasked with preparing massive outdoor feasts using techniques learned from indigenous peoples and modified by European colonists. What emerged from this convergence would eventually become recognized as one of America's few truly original culinary contributions, though it would take centuries for the contributions of enslaved cooks to receive proper acknowledgement. The colonial barbecue was a spectacle unlike anything in Europe. George Washington's diaries mention attending barbecues that lasted for days, with whole oxen, pigs, and sheep roasting over trenches filled with coals. These weren't intimate gatherings. Colonial newspapers from the 1700s describe political barbecues drawing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, all classes mingling in ways that would have been unthinkable in European society, though of course, the enslaved people doing most of the cooking weren't exactly mingling, they were working. Here's something that might surprise you. The word barbecue first appears in English print in 1661, in Edmund Hickeringill's Jamaica Viewed. But by 1733, when it shows up in colonial American newspapers, it's already transformed into something else entirely, a social event, a verb, a uniquely American institution. The speed of this linguistic evolution tells us something about how quickly this cooking method embedded itself in colonial culture. The techniques being developed were far more sophisticated than many histories suggest. Enslaved cooks brought knowledge of complex spice combinations from West African traditions. They understood how to use peppers not just for heat, but for preservation, how to create marinades that both flavored and tenderized tough cuts. Some food historians argue that what we now call the low and slow method, that patient relationship with smoke and time, owes as much to West African smoking traditions as to indigenous American techniques. You can picture these colonial barbecues, and honestly, they were probably chaos. Hundreds of people gathered in fields, musicians playing, children running between the fires, dogs fighting over scraps. And through it all, enslaved pitmasters tending fires that couldn't be allowed to die, couldn't flame up, had to maintain that perfect temperature for hours, sometimes days. They developed techniques for banking coals, for reading smoke color, for knowing by sound when fat was rendering just right. All this expertise passed down through whispered instruction because formal teaching was forbidden. Virginia developed its own distinct approach early on, focusing on pork, which thrived in the colonial environment. Pigs could forage in forests, required minimal care, and multiplied rapidly. But here's where scholarly arguments get interesting. Some historians claim Virginia's preference for pork barbecue stems purely from practical considerations. Others point to cultural preferences brought by English settlers. Still others note that enslaved Muslims who wouldn't eat pork were sometimes specifically assigned to tend these barbecues, a cruel irony that speaks to the power dynamics underlying even our food traditions. The Carolinas were developing their own variations by the early 1700s. North Carolina's eastern regions perfected whole hog cooking, every part of the animal slow roasted until even the skin crackled into edible chips. Meanwhile, South Carolina's coast, with its significant population of enslaved people from rice-growing regions of West Africa, developed a mustard-based sauce tradition that some historians trace directly to African cooking practices, though this connection remains debated. What fascinates me about this period is how barbecue became simultaneously a symbol of American abundance and a reminder of American inequality. These massive public barbecues celebrated colonial prosperity, yet they were built on the expertise of people who couldn't legally own property, couldn't legally learn to read. The smoke that flavored the meat also obscured these contradictions, at least for those who wanted to look away. Political barbecues became essential to colonial democracy, or what passed for democracy then. By the 1750s, no serious political candidate could campaign without hosting massive barbecues. George Washington's papers record that for his 1758 House of Burgesses campaign, he provided voters with 160 gallons of rum, beer, and cider, along with a barbecue feast. The act of gathering around smoking pits became a form of political expression, a uniquely American way of building community and consensus. The Revolutionary War era saw barbecue take on patriotic dimensions. Correspondence from the period describes Liberty barbecues, where colonists gathered to protest British taxes, to organize resistance, to celebrate victories. Even the French observer Moreau de Saint-Amand noted in the 1790s that Americans had a decided preference for barbecues that seemed to transcend regional boundaries. The documentation from this period, frustratingly incomplete as it is, hints at innovations we'll never fully understand. Plantation records mention enslaved cooks by name, always with diminutive titles that denied them full personhood, yet these same records reveal that their expertise was so valued that they were sometimes borrowed between plantations for special events. Their knowledge was precious, even if they themselves weren't treated as such. As the 1700s drew to a close, barbecue had evolved from a Caribbean preservation technique into something uniquely complex, part cooking method, part social institution, part political theater. The foundation was set for regional variations that would eventually inspire fierce loyalty. The smoke was spreading across the continent, carrying with it all the complicated history of American expansion, and in each new territory, each new state, local traditions would begin to emerge, each adding another layer to an already complex story that was just beginning to simmer. The smoke begins to change as you drift into the early 1800s. different woods create distinct signatures across the emerging American South. In the Carolinas, hickory smoke mingles with the sweet scent of applewood. In Virginia and Kentucky, oak and maple join the mix. Further west, in places that aren't quite states yet, mesquite starts appearing, each region's barbecue becoming as distinctive as its accent. Regional styles weren't born from deliberate innovation. They emerged from necessity, availability, and accumulated accidents that became traditions. North Carolina's Eastern whole hog tradition, for instance, developed partly because coastal planters had smaller farms than their Virginia neighbors. A whole hog could feed a community gathering without waste. The vinegar-based sauce that became synonymous with the region? Food historians suggest it might have started as simple preservation, vinegar being one of the few acidic ingredients that wouldn't spoil in southern heat. But here's where the historical record gets deliciously contentious. South Carolina claims the oldest barbecue tradition in America, pointing to records from the 1700s. North Carolina disputes this, citing their own colonial documents. Virginia quietly insists that since they had the first permanent English settlement, obviously their barbecue came first. These arguments might seem trivial, but they reveal something profound about how food becomes identity, how recipes become heritage. The development of regional wood preferences tells its own story of American expansion. Hickory dominated the Southeast because hickory trees thrived there after centuries of indigenous forest management. The Texas preference for oak and mesquite? That emerged after the 1820s when American settlers began moving into Mexican territory. They found that mesquite, which Mexican vaqueros had used for generations, gave beef a distinctive sharpness that cut through the richness of fatty brisket. You might assume these regional differences developed in isolation, but evidence suggests otherwise. The early 1800s saw surprising mobility among enslaved and free black pitmasters. Through hiring out systems, skilled barbecue cooks traveled between states, carrying techniques and recipes that would cross-pollinate regional styles. A pitmaster from South Carolina might spend a season in Georgia, teaching mustard sauce techniques that would eventually become part of Georgia's Middle Region tradition. What scholars find particularly intriguing is how quickly these regional variations became codified, almost sacred. By the 1830s, newspapers were already documenting fierce debates about proper barbecue. Letters to editors argued about sauce versus no sauce, whole hog versus shoulders, direct heat versus indirect. The passion in these letters, you'd think they were debating constitutional amendments rather than cooking methods. The westward expansion of the 1840s created entirely new barbecue territories. As settlers pushed into Texas, they encountered Mexican vaquero traditions of barbacoa, specifically the technique of cooking cow heads and other tough cuts in underground pits. This merged with German smoking traditions brought by immigrants to central Texas. The result was something unprecedented, beef-centric barbecue that would have horrified pork-devoted Carolinians. I find it remarkable that during this period of regional differentiation, there was one consistent element, the centrality of the pitmaster. These individuals, many of them enslaved until the 1860s, were recognized as artists, their names recorded even when their freedom wasn't. Old Arthur of Williamsburg, Uncle John of Charleston, Aunt May of Lexington. Their techniques were closely guarded secrets, passed down through demonstrations rather than written recipes. The rise of commercial barbecue restaurants in the 1830s and 1840s added another layer to regional development. These weren't the roadside joints we know today. They were often back alley establishments in southern cities, frequently run by free black entrepreneurs who had saved enough to buy their freedom and start businesses. The historical record shows that these early restaurants faced constant harassment from white competitors, yet they persisted, their success testament to the undeniable quality of their product. Transportation improvements in the 1850s began creating what some historians call the barbecue belt. The expansion of railroads meant that regional styles started encountering each other more frequently. Railroad workers from Memphis might taste Carolina barbecue for the first time. Texas cattle drivers might discover Alabama's white sauce. These encounters sometimes led to fusion, but more often they reinforced regional pride. "That's not real barbecue" became a refrain that echoes to this day. Kentucky developed its own peculiar tradition during this period, mutton barbecue, which food historians trace to the Welsh settlers who brought sheep farming expertise to the region. The strong flavor of mutton required different treatment than pork or beef, longer marinating, different wood combinations, specific sauce formulations. By the 1850s, Owensboro had established itself as the mutton barbecue capital, a title it still claims. Alabama's distinctive white sauce, that mayonnaise-based creation that makes other regions shudder, actually has roots in the 1830s, though the modern version wouldn't appear until much later. Early versions might have been attempts to recreate French remoulade using available ingredients, or possibly German-influenced attempts at cream sauces adapted to local tastes. The exact origin remains one of barbecue history's unsolved mysteries. Tennessee began developing its dry rub tradition in the 1840s, particularly in Memphis. The technique possibly arose from the city's position as a river port. Spices from New Orleans moved upriver, creating access to paprika, cayenne, and other seasonings that inland areas couldn't easily obtain. The dry rub allowed meat to be prepared in advance and held longer, practical for a commercial center where timing mattered. As the 1850s drew to a close, regional barbecue styles had become so distinct that they served as cultural markers. You could tell where someone was from by how they prepared their sauce, what would they preferred, whether they chopped or pulled their pork. These differences weren't just culinary, they were becoming tribal, ancestral, worth defending. The approaching conflict of the 1860s would disrupt these regional developments, scatter pitmasters, destroy establishments, interrupt traditions. But it would also create new opportunities. new migrations, new fusions. The smoke that had been rising from regional pits was about to be mixed with gunpowder smoke, and when it cleared, when the nation tried to rebuild, barbecue would play a surprising role in both dividing and potentially healing a fractured country. But those stories of reconstruction and reinvention, they require their own telling. The year is 1865, and across the South, smoke rises from different kinds of fires than before. Not the controlled, patient smoke of barbecue pits, but the acrid smoke of burned plantations, destroyed railroads, abandoned farms. Yet somehow, in this landscape of devastation, barbecue would become one of the first businesses many formerly enslaved people would claim as their own. Historical records from the Reconstruction era reveal something remarkable. Within months of emancipation, formerly enslaved pitmasters were establishing commercial barbecue operations across the South. These weren't just food stands, they were declarations of independence, assertions of expertise that no one could deny. Men and women who had been property were now proprietors, their skill with smoke and meat providing economic opportunity that few other trades could match. The names that appear in business directories from the 1860s and 1870s tell powerful stories. Henry Perry in Memphis, later credited with bringing barbecue to Kansas City. Matt Garner in North Carolina, who parlayed his reputation into successful catering businesses. These entrepreneurs faced enormous obstacles: black codes, Jim Crow laws, violent intimidation, yet they persisted because barbecue offered something unique, a product so undeniably superior that even hostile customers couldn't stay away. What many contemporary accounts don't mention, but financial records reveal, is that these early black-owned barbecue businesses often became informal banks for their communities. Pitmasters with successful operations would extend credit, make loans, hold savings for customers who couldn't use white-owned banks. The barbecue restaurant became more than a place to eat. It was an economic hub, a community center, a rare space of Black autonomy in the Jim Crow South. Like the transformation happening in Texas during this same period, where formerly enslaved cowboys were perfecting what would become the legendary Texas brisket. The technique required incredible skill, maintaining exact temperatures for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. 1 degree too hot and the meat turned tough. 1 degree too cool and it never developed that coveted smoke ring. These pitmasters couldn't read or write. Many states made teaching them illegal even after emancipation, yet they could read smoke color, meat texture, and fire behavior with scientific precision. The documented success of these businesses challenges many assumptions about Reconstruction. In Athens, Georgia, a formerly enslaved man named Johnny Ward built a barbecue empire that made him one of the wealthiest black men in the state by 1880. In Goldsboro, North Carolina, Adam Scott's barbecue restaurant became so renowned that presidential candidates made pilgrimages there. These weren't exceptions. They were part of a pattern that historians are only now fully documenting. You know what's particularly striking about this period? The development of what food historians call freedom sauces. Former enslaved cooks, no longer bound to their master's preferences, began experimenting with bolder flavors, more vinegar, more pepper, more personality. Some scholars argue that the intense, assertive flavors of many regional sauces developed during Reconstruction, when Black pitmasters could finally cook for themselves and their communities rather than for white palates. The railroad expansion that accelerated after the Civil War created new opportunities and challenges. Black-owned barbecue stands appeared at virtually every Southern Railroad station, providing one of the few dining options for Black travelers in the segregated South. These stands developed portable techniques, ways to keep meat warm and moist for hours, innovations born from necessity that would later influence fast food technology. But let's be clear about the violence that shadowed these successes. Prosperous Black barbecue restaurants were targets for white resentment. The historical record documents numerous cases of successful establishments burned down, owners driven from towns, sometimes killed. In 1876, a successful barbecue restaurant owner in Hamburg, South Carolina, was lynched. His crime was refusing to cater a white political rally. His name was Simon Coker, and his story was repeated across the South. The period from 1870 to 1890 saw the emergence of what might be called barbecue diplomacy. White politicians, recognizing the political importance of barbecue gatherings, would hire Black pitmasters for major events, creating temporary, transactional relationships that crossed racial lines. These events were studies in contradiction. Black expertise celebrated while Black humanity was denied. The pitmaster might be praised for his skill while being forbidden to eat with the guests he served. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals fascinating details about these early commercial operations. Excavations of post-Civil War barbecue sites show sophisticated pit designs, complex ventilation systems, specialized tools that suggest a level of technical innovation previously unrecognized. These weren't primitive operations, they were engineered systems developed through generations of accumulated knowledge. The migration patterns of the 1880s and 1890s spread Southern barbecue techniques northward and westward. As Black families fled Jim Crow violence, they carried barbecue expertise to Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, establishing beachheads of Southern cuisine that would eventually transform American eating. Every major northern city's barbecue tradition can trace its roots to these Reconstruction-era migrations. Women's roles in barbecue also evolved during this period, though their contributions remain frustratingly underdocumented. We know from scattered records that women like Mary Jones in Atlanta and Sarah Franklin in Richmond operated successful barbecue businesses. They faced double discrimination, dismissed both for their race and gender, yet customer testimonials that survive suggest their food was often superior to their male competitors. The emergence of barbecue competitions in the 1880s created new venues for recognition, though most were segregated. Black pitmasters would compete in separate categories, often with inferior prizes despite superior products. Still, these competitions provided rare opportunities for public acknowledgement of skill. Some white newspaper accounts from the period grudgingly admit that black competitors consistently produced better barbecue. By the 1890s, distinct barbecue territories had solidified, each with its own techniques, sauces, and traditions, many traceable directly to specific Reconstruction-era pitmasters. The foundation for America's regional barbecue map was laid not by famous chefs or restaurant chains, but by formerly enslaved people who transformed survival skills into culinary art. The dawn of the new century would bring new challenges: industrialization, urbanization, the Great Migration. Forces that would scatter these barbecue traditions across the continent. But something had been proven in those difficult decades after emancipation, that barbecue was more than food. It was culture, identity, resistance, and opportunity all mixed together, seasoned with smoke and time. And as the 20th century approached, this mixture was about to spread in ways no one could have predicted. Picture a suburban driveway in 1952. A man in a white shirt and narrow tie stands beside a strange black kettle on legs, his neighbors gathering around this curious contraption with equal parts skepticism and fascination. This is George Stephen, a welder at Weber Brothers Metal Works in Chicago, showing off his latest invention, a covered grill made from a buoy cut in half. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to transform barbecue from a community ritual into a family one. The post-war suburbs were hungry for something, not just food, but identity. These newly minted homeowners, many of them veterans who'd eaten barbecue across the South during training, wanted to recreate those flavors in their quarter-acre kingdoms. But traditional barbecue, the kind that required digging pits, tending fires for days, managing smoke that annoyed neighbors, that didn't translate to Levittown. What's fascinating about this period is how quickly barbecue adapted to suburban constraints. The Weber kettle grill, patented in 1952, solved multiple problems at once. It contained the fire, controlled the smoke, and most importantly, it made barbecue respectable, middle class. Something you could do in your backyard without looking like you were roasting roadkill. Within 5 years, Weber was selling 50,000 units annually. The historical record suggests that this suburban barbecue revolution was deeply gendered in ways that reversed traditional roles. For centuries, barbecue had been men's work at public events, but women's domain at home. Now, suddenly, the backyard grill became masculine territory. Dad's domain. Sociologists argue this shift reflected post-war anxieties about masculinity. Returning soldiers needed spaces to assert traditional gender roles in increasingly corporate, confined lives. But here's what most nostalgic histories miss. The suburban barbecue boom coincided with the Highway Act of 1956 and white flight from cities. As black families were systematically excluded from suburban homeownership through redlining and racial covenants, barbecue began splitting into two distinct traditions, urban and suburban, authentic and adapted. The very families whose ancestors had perfected American barbecue were being locked out of the suburban dream where barbecue was being reimagined. The convenience food industry quickly recognized opportunity. By 1955, Kraft had introduced the first mass-produced barbecue sauce. Heinz followed in 1957. These sauces, sweeter and thicker than traditional regional varieties, were engineered for suburban palates. They covered mistakes, masked the flavor of cheaper cuts, and most importantly, they were consistent, predictable, safe. Everything the suburbs valued. I'll admit, there's something both wonderful and sad about looking at advertisements from this era. Happy families gathered around pristine grills. Dad in his apron wielding a spatula like a scepter. Mom in her dress bringing out potato salad. It's a vision of American contentment that excludes so much, erases so much history. Yet for millions of Americans, this became what barbecue meant. The technology evolved rapidly. Gas grills appeared in 1959, promising real barbecue flavor without the mess, which is rather like promising real swimming without water, but suburban consumers loved them. Rotisseries, temperature gauges, multiple burners. Each innovation moved further from traditional barbecue while claiming to perfect it. The ancient art of reading smoke color was replaced by consulting thermometer dials. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening in urban centers. Black-owned barbecue restaurants, pushed out of gentrifying downtown areas, were establishing themselves in neighborhoods that would become barbecue corridors. Chicago's South Side, Kansas City's 18th and Vine, Memphis's Orange Mound. These weren't suburban adaptations, they were continuations of authentic traditions, maintaining the low and slow methods that suburbs were abandoning. The cookbook explosion of the late 1950s reveals the class dynamics at play. Betty Crocker's Guide to Outdoor Cooking presented barbecue as civilized entertainment, while community cookbooks from Black churches preserved traditional techniques under titles like Sister Sarah's Sacred Smoke Secrets. Two parallel barbecue cultures were developing, one published by major publishers, the other mimeographed and passed hand to hand. Television accelerated these changes. The first nationally broadcast barbecue demonstration appeared on The Arthur Godfrey Show in 1954. Godfrey, grilling hamburgers on a hibachi, told millions of viewers this was real American barbecue. Actual pitmasters watching must have wept, or laughed, or possibly both. But this became the image: quick, clean, suburban. The invention of charcoal briquettes deserves its own consideration. Henry Ford had actually developed them in the 1920s from wood scraps, but it was the 1950s suburban market that made them ubiquitous. Kingsford charcoal, originally Ford charcoal, sold the promise of controlled fire, predictable heat, no mess. The irregular, smoky burns of actual wood became something to avoid rather than master. Regional barbecue restaurants tried to adapt to suburban expansion with mixed results. Some opened satellite locations near new shopping centers, but the economics rarely worked. Real barbecue required time, expertise, and equipment that didn't scale to suburban strip malls. The few that succeeded often did so by abandoning traditional methods, switching to gas-fired ovens, pre-made sauces, faster cooking times. By 1960, the American barbecue had effectively split into two distinct practices sharing a name. Traditional barbecue continued in rural areas and urban neighborhoods, maintained by families and communities who'd inherited generations of knowledge. Suburban barbecue became something else entirely. Grilling, really. Faster, cleaner, more about the social ritual than the food itself. The irony wasn't lost on everyone. Cultural critics of the era reportedly observed that suburban barbecue had transformed into something fundamentally different from its origins, comparing it to the difference between processed convenience food and authentic home cooking. The observation captured something essential. The suburbs had adopted barbecue's form while abandoning its soul. Yet we shouldn't dismiss suburban barbecue entirely. For millions of Americans, those backyard gatherings created genuine community, real memories, authentic joy. The dad burning hot dogs while kids played in sprinklers, the mom perfecting her potato salad recipe, the neighbors gathering as daylight faded. This too became tradition, different from what came before, certainly, but meaningful in its own right. The stage was now set for barbecue's next transformation. As interstate highways carved through the country and automobiles became extensions of American identity, barbecue would find new expressions along these rivers of asphalt. The roadside barbecue joint was about to become as essential to American travel as the gas station, maybe more so, because while your car needed fuel, your soul needed smoke. The summer of 1962, somewhere along Route 66, and your car's been running hot for the last 50 miles. But that's not what makes you pull over. It's the smoke you've been smelling for the last 5 miles, the sweet hickory haze that seems to pull your steering wheel toward a wooden shack with a hand-painted sign. Barbecue, 500 feet. This is the golden age of the roadside barbecue joint, when America's new interstate highways became lined with smoke signals. The interstate highway system, officially launched in 1956, did more than connect cities. It created an entirely new ecosystem for barbecue. Small towns bypassed by the interstates watched their main street restaurants wither, while previously isolated crossroads suddenly found themselves serving thousands of travelers daily. The geography of American barbecue was being redrawn by asphalt and exit ramps. What's remarkable about this period is how these roadside joints became cultural ambassadors. A family from Ohio driving to Florida for vacation might taste Carolina vinegar sauce for the first time at a highway pit stop. Truckers became unofficial barbecue critics, spreading word about hidden gems along their routes. CB radio chatter in the 1970s was filled with references to that place at exit 47 or the shack behind the Texaco. Some historians suggest this period did more to nationalize barbecue awareness than any other factor. The architecture of these roadside barbecue joints tells its own story. They were deliberately rustic, even when newly built. Weathered wood, tin roofs, smoke-stained walls, all designed to convey authenticity in an increasingly plastic landscape. The more ramshackle the building, the better the barbecue, or so the mythology went. Though truth be told, some of the best barbecue came from gleaming new restaurants, and some of the worst from picturesquely decrepit shacks. But here's something the nostalgic road trip histories often overlook. Many of these highway barbecue joints existed in a complex racial landscape. The Green Book, that essential guide for Black travelers during Jim Crow, listed which barbecue restaurants would serve Black customers. Some of the most famous joints had 2 entrances, 2 dining rooms, sometimes even 2 different menus. The interstate might have been integrated, but the restaurants along it often weren't. The economics of highway barbecue created new innovations. Restaurants needed to serve customers quickly without sacrificing the low and slow tradition. This led to the development of massive rotating pits that could cook continuously, holding systems that kept meat at perfect temperature for hours, sauce stations where customers could customize their meals. These weren't shortcuts, they were engineering solutions to the challenge of serving authentic barbecue at highway speed. I remember reading an interview with a pitmaster from this era who said the hardest part wasn't the cooking, it was the performing. Highway customers expected a show, wanted to see the pit, smell the smoke, watch the meat being pulled or chopped. The barbecue joint became theater, with the pitmaster as the star. Authenticity became something you performed as much as preserved. The rise of franchising in the 1960s threatened to homogenize highway barbecue. Chains like Hickory Log and Per Folks promised consistent barbecue from coast to coast. They mostly failed. Barbecue, it turned out, resisted standardization. Each attempt to create the McDonald's of barbecue foundered on the reality that real barbecue couldn't be systematized, couldn't be reduced to an operations manual. The chains that survived did so by abandoning authentic barbecue for something faster, simpler, less demanding. Meanwhile, individual joints were becoming legends. Arthur Bryant's in Kansas City, where jazz musicians would stop after late-night sessions. Dreamland in Tuscaloosa, where Bear Bryant would bring rival coaches. The Salt Lake outside Austin, where the smoke could be seen from planes approaching the airport. These places became pilgrimage sites, worth driving hundreds of miles out of your way. The interstate system also accelerated regional cross-pollination. A Memphis-style restaurant might open near a highway in Georgia. A Texas pitmaster might set up shop at an Illinois truck stop. Purists complained about authenticity, but customers voted with their wallets. They wanted variety, comparison, the ability to taste different styles without crossing state lines. The rigid regional boundaries that had defined barbecue for a century began to blur. Women's roles in highway barbecue joints deserve particular attention. While men typically worked the pits, women often ran everything else: the dining room, the register, the sauce production. Many of the most successful highway joints were husband-wife operations, with the woman's business acumen being as crucial as the man's pitmaster skills, though credit, predictably, usually went to the man alone. The advent of the automobile air conditioner in the mid-1960s changed highway barbecue in unexpected ways. Suddenly, travelers weren't desperate to stop and cool off. Restaurants had to work harder to attract customers. This led to increasingly elaborate signs, some with neon pigs, others with smoke machines, a few with recorded messages broadcast to passing cars. The competition for attention became almost as intense as the competition for flavor. Environmental regulations in the 1970s posed new challenges. Many highway joints had been grandfathered into loose local smoke ordinances, but federal highway standards were different. Some restaurants had to install expensive filtration systems. Others were forced to relocate. A few simply closed, their owners unable or unwilling to adapt. The smell of barbecue along American highways began to fade, replaced by the sterile scent of fast food fryers. By the late 1970s, the interstate barbecue landscape had solidified into three categories: the authentic survivors, usually family operations that had found the sweet spot between tradition and efficiency; the compromised chains, serving a product that resembled barbecue but wasn't quite; and the tourist traps, selling atmosphere and nostalgia more than good food. Travelers had to learn to distinguish between them, to read the signs beyond the signs. The CB radio culture of the 1970s created an informal network of barbecue intelligence. Truckers would share real-time updates about which joints were worth stopping for, which had gone downhill, which had health department issues. Breaker, breaker, this is Big Daddy. Avoid the pit at mile marker 84. Saw roaches bigger than the ribs. This underground information network kept quality joints in business and punished those that cut corners. As the 1970s ended, something was shifting in American barbecue culture. The highway joint was no longer the only game in town. Urban barbecue was experiencing a renaissance. Competition circuits were creating celebrity pitmasters. Food television was about to discover smoking meat. The simple roadside shack with its painted sign and smoking chimney would remain, but it would soon be competing with something entirely new. The age of barbecue as competitive sport was about to begin, and with it would come sauces so secret they required armed guards, techniques so protected they sparked lawsuits, and a level of regional pride that would make previous disputes look like friendly disagreements. Memphis, May 1978. The smell of smoke from 100 pits fills Tom Lee Park along the Mississippi River. Teams with names like the Hogaholics and Swine Lake Ballet tend their rigs with the intensity of Formula One pit crews. This is the first Memphis in May World Championship Barbecue Cooking Contest, and though nobody realizes it yet, American barbecue is about to become a competitive sport. The origins of organized barbecue competition reveal something peculiar about American culture: the need to rank, score, and declare winners in everything, even something as subjective as taste. The Memphis organizers established categories: ribs, shoulder, whole hog, created judging criteria: appearance, tenderness, flavor, turned an ancient art into something that could be scored on a scale of 1 to 10. What makes this transformation fascinating is how seriously everyone took it almost immediately. By 1985, when the Kansas City Barbecue Society formed, they developed a judging system so complex it required certification courses. Judges had to learn to score meat on multiple criteria, be able to detect illegal additives, understand the difference between fall off the bone and overcooked. Terms like bite through and smoke ring became technical specifications rather than casual descriptions. The rules that emerged from these early competitions would have baffled traditional pitmasters. No sauce could touch the meat until after judging. Garnish could only be green lettuce and parsley. Meat had to be presented in a specific styrofoam container. Each rule had a story, usually involving someone who'd tried to game the system: the guy who'd hidden inferior meat under elaborate garnish, the team that had injected their ribs with butter. But here's what the competition circuit discovered, probably to everyone's surprise: regional styles became more distinct, not less. Teams doubled down on their local traditions. Carolina teams became more aggressive with vinegar. Texas teams more adamant about beef. Kansas City teams more elaborate with their sauces. Competition didn't homogenize barbecue. It crystallized regional identity into something almost militant. The economics of competitive barbecue created a new class of weekend warriors. Dentists, lawyers, accountants who spent tens of thousands on custom rigs, traveled hundreds of miles to compete for trophies and modest prize money that couldn't possibly cover expenses. By the late 1980s, some teams were spending more on a single competition than most restaurants spent on equipment in a year. I find it almost comical how elaborate the psychological warfare became. Teams would spray artificial smoke to throw off competitors' timing, play loud music to disturb neighboring teams' concentration. Some would wake at 3 a.m. just to add wood to their fire, not because the meat needed it, but so rivals would panic thinking they'd started too late. The sauce wars that erupted during this period deserve special attention. Recipes became more closely guarded than state secrets. Some competitors registered their sauces with lawyers. Others used code names for ingredients. Project Red Dawn might mean adding molasses. Operation Sweetness could indicate brown sugar. A few paranoid teams actually hired security guards to watch their prep areas. Meanwhile, traditional pitmasters watched this circus with reactions ranging from amusement to horror. These were people who'd learned barbecue from their grandparents, who'd never measured an ingredient in their lives, who judged doneness by sound and texture, not thermometers. To them, the idea of barbecue as competition missed the entire point. Barbecue was about community, patience, tradition, not trophies. The competition circuit also revealed uncomfortable truths about barbecue culture. These events were overwhelmingly white and male, despite barbecue's deep roots in Black communities. African American pitmasters, many of whom ran the most respected restaurants in their regions, rarely participated. The entry fees, travel costs, and equipment requirements created barriers, but so did the culture, the sense that this wasn't their game even though it was their art. Women faced their own challenges on the circuit, often relegated to auxiliary categories like sides and desserts, even when they were the actual pitmasters on mixed teams. The first all-female team to win a major championship in 1989 faced skepticism and accusations that they must have had male help. Their victory was both celebrated and diminished, proof that women could compete, but treated as an anomaly rather than acknowledgement of women's long history in barbecue. The rise of celebrity judges added another layer of complexity. By the mid-1980s, having certain judges at your competition became a draw. These judges developed followings, published newsletters, conducted seminars. Some competitors would study individual judges' preferences, knowing that Judge Smith favored more smoke, while Judge Jones penalized too much char. The meat became almost secondary to the metagame of understanding judging patterns. Competition barbecue began developing its own aesthetic, distinct from restaurant or backyard barbecue. Ribs had to have perfect symmetry. Brisket needed uniform smoke rings. Chicken skin had to be bite-through, but not rubbery. This wasn't how anyone actually wanted to eat barbecue. It was barbecue as abstract ideal, optimized for scoring rather than satisfaction. The equipment arms race that began in the 1980s would have seemed like science fiction to earlier pitmasters. Temperature controllers that maintained heat within 1 degree, injection systems that distributed moisture uniformly, rotating drums that ensured even cooking. One team supposedly spent $50,000 on a custom rig with more computing power than early space missions, all to cook a pork shoulder. Regional competitions spawned regional pride that bordered on nationalism. North Carolina competitions banned tomato-based sauces. Texas events sometimes excluded pork categories entirely. Kansas City competitions required 4 meats, forcing specialists to become generalists. Each region's rules reinforced their belief that their way was the right way, the only way, the way God intended. By 1990, the competition circuit had created its own economy. Vendors selling specialized equipment, consultants teaching winning techniques, even barbecue psychologists helping teams handle competition pressure. What had started as friendly local cook-offs had evolved into a multi-million-dollar industry, complete with sponsorships, television coverage, and professional teams who competed full-time. The irony wasn't lost on everyone. Here was barbecue, born from necessity and poverty, transformed into an expensive hobby. The people who'd created and perfected these techniques out of survival were now priced out of competing. Their contributions honored in theory while they were excluded in practice. The smoke that rose from competition pits might have smelled the same, but it carried different meanings, different stories. And as the 1990s approached, those stories were about to be broadcast to millions, transforming barbecue from regional curiosity to national obsession. The year is 1993. Food Network launches into American homes, and suddenly a chef named Bobby Flay is teaching millions how to make barbecue sauce in their suburban kitchens. This is the beginning of barbecue's transformation from regional secret to national entertainment. Though what appeared on screen often bore little resemblance to what traditional pitmasters had been doing for generations. Television's relationship with barbecue proved complicated from the start. The medium demanded visual drama, but real barbecue is about waiting, watching smoke, maintaining temperature for hours. Producers solved this by focusing on personality over process. The pitmaster became a character, usually portrayed as a colorful southerner with secret techniques and folksy wisdom, even when the actual pitmaster might be a soft-spoken professional who'd studied food science. What's remarkable about this period is how quickly television created barbecue celebrities. Pitmasters who'd been unknown outside their counties suddenly found themselves signing autographs. Their restaurants, once local institutions, became tourist destinations. Lines that had been manageable became hours long. Some traditionalists argue this attention ruined as many places as it helped, forcing small operations to expand beyond their capability. The show Barbecue Pit Masters premiered in 2009, bringing competition barbecue to prime time, but the editing told stories that competitors barely recognized. Manufactured drama replaced the actual tension of maintaining temperature. Conflicts were exaggerated or invented entirely. One competitor later revealed that producers asked him to act angry about another team's success to create a rivalry that didn't exist. The show succeeded in making barbecue compelling television, but at the cost of authenticity. Evidence suggests that food television fundamentally changed how Americans thought about barbecue. Pre-television, most people knew only their regional style. Television introduced the idea that barbecue was diverse, worth exploring, worth arguing about. Suddenly, people in Maine were debating Kansas City versus Carolina sauce. Californians were attempting Texas brisket. The nationalization of barbecue knowledge accelerated exponentially. But here's what bothers me about this era. Television barbecue became increasingly disconnected from barbecue's roots. Shows featured expensive equipment, exotic ingredients, techniques that required professional training. The working class origins, the African American innovations, the immigrant contributions, these stories were mentioned occasionally but rarely centered. Barbecue was being repackaged as upscale dining rather than democratic feast. The rise of celebrity chef barbecue created its own controversies. Classically trained chefs began opening barbecue restaurants that purists considered abominations. Using sous vide instead of smoke, adding truffle oil to sauce, serving brisket with microgreens. Food critics praised innovation while traditionalists mourned the loss of authenticity. The question, "What is real barbecue?" became genuinely contentious. Travel Channel's Man v. Food and similar shows created a different phenomenon: competitive eating as entertainment. Barbecue restaurants began creating absurd challenges: 5-pound platters, ghost pepper sauces, sandwiches requiring liability waivers. This spectacle had nothing to do with barbecue tradition. It was pure carnival, yet it drove significant traffic to participating restaurants. The documentation of barbecue through television proved double-edged. On one hand, techniques and traditions were being preserved on film, recipes shared widely, stories told that might otherwise be forgotten. On the other hand, the medium's demands for drama, personality, and visual appeal distorted these traditions, made them performative rather than practical. Regional barbecue associations responded to television's influence in various ways. Some embraced it, creating media-friendly events and spokespeople. Others retreated, becoming more insular and protective of their traditions. A few tried to use television to correct misconceptions, though they quickly learned that nuanced history made poor ratings. The economics of television barbecue created new opportunities and pressures. Restaurants featured on shows saw immediate spikes in business, sometimes increasing sales by 500% overnight. But this blessing could become a curse. Many couldn't handle the volume. Quality suffered. Locals stopped coming. Some places closed within a year of their television appearance, victims of their own success. Women pitmasters found television both liberating and limiting. Shows began featuring female competitors and owners, but often emphasized their gender as the story rather than their skill. "Can this housewife compete with the boys?" became a tired narrative, ignoring that women had been running successful barbecue operations for generations, just without cameras. Food Network's influence extended beyond programming to product placement. Suddenly, every grocery store carried pitmaster rubs. Authentic sauces endorsed by television personalities. Competition style equipment for backyard cooks. The commodification of barbecue accelerated, turning traditions into products, techniques into purchasable shortcuts. The international spread of American barbecue through television deserves mention. Shows dubbed or subtitled in dozens of languages spread barbecue gospel globally. Restaurants claiming authentic American barbecue opened in Tokyo, London, Sydney, often run by people whose entire knowledge came from television, creating fascinating mutations of already evolved traditions. By the mid-2000s, television had created distinct categories of barbecue establishments. The TV famous spots with lines around the block. The deliberately unfamous joints that refused all media. The trying to be discovered places that courted producers. Each category served different audiences: tourists versus locals, entertainment versus sustenance. The rise of YouTube and streaming services in the late 2000s democratized barbecue media somewhat. small channels could document traditional techniques without commercial pressure. Pitmasters could share knowledge directly, without producer interference. Yet even this democratic medium tended toward spectacle. The videos that went viral were rarely the careful explanations of traditional techniques. As the 2010s approached, barbecue had become thoroughly mediated, experienced as much through screens as through smoke. The ancient art of reading fire had been replaced by watching temperature gauges on television. The communal experience of gathering around pits had become the solitary experience of viewing on devices. Yet, paradoxically, this media attention also sparked renewed interest in authentic experiences, in seeking out the places television hadn't found, hadn't ruined. The smoke might be digital now, but people still craved the real thing. And that craving was about to manifest in ways that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. July 4th, 2015. And across America, an estimated 87 million grills fire up almost simultaneously. The smoke rising from backyards, parks, and beaches creates what meteorologists can actually detect on weather radar, a continental haze of celebration. This isn't just a holiday anymore. It's the high holy day of American barbecue, though how it achieved this status reveals as much about marketing as tradition. The association between barbecue and the 4th of July wasn't always inevitable. Colonial Independence Day celebrations featured cannon fire and speeches, not necessarily cooking outdoors. Historical records from the 1800s show picnics, certainly, but barbecue as the centerpiece? That evolution happened gradually, then suddenly, accelerating dramatically after World War II when patriotism and prosperity merged in suburban backyards. What surveys from this period reveal is striking. By 2010, various industry studies suggested that over 70% of American households would grill on July 4th, making it the single biggest barbecue day of the year, surpassing Memorial Day, Labor Day, even Father's Day. The Hearth, Patio, and Barbecue Association, yes, that's a real organization, estimated that Americans would consume approximately 150 million hot dogs on this single day, though calling hot dogs barbecue might cause traditional pitmasters to weep. The commercialization of patriotic barbecue created fascinating contradictions. Grocery stores stocked Freedom Rubs and Liberty Sauce, products that would have baffled the founders. Television commercials portrayed barbecuing as quintessentially American, conveniently forgetting its Caribbean origins, African innovations, and immigrant contributions. The melting pot had become a grill, but the story of who stirred it was being simplified beyond recognition. Evidence from sales data shows how retailers shaped this connection. Starting in the 1990s, stores began treating July 4th like barbecue Christmas. Special displays appeared in May. Promotional tie-ins linked grills to flag sales. Even the color scheme of barbecue packaging shifted. More red, white, and blue appearing on sauce labels and charcoal bags. Marketing had made barbecue patriotic. But here's something I find genuinely touching about this phenomenon. For all its commercial exploitation, the July 4th barbecue had become a real tradition for millions. Families developed their own rituals. Dad's special burger recipe, Mom's secret potato salad, Grandpa's stories about barbecues past. These manufactured traditions had generated authentic memories, artificial roots that had somehow grown real. The democratization of July 4th barbecue crossed economic lines in interesting ways. Public parks with community grills became gathering spots for families who couldn't afford backyard setups. Apartment dwellers congregated on rooftops and in courtyards. The smell of charcoal became a class equalizer, at least for one day, though what was on those grills varied dramatically by zip code. Different immigrant communities adapted July 4th barbecue to their own traditions. Korean families grilled bulgogi alongside hamburgers. Mexican Americans incorporated carne asada. Indian Americans created tandoori spiced variations. The American barbecue proved remarkably absorbent, capable of incorporating almost any flavor profile while maintaining its essential identity. The rise of barbecue competitions specifically for July 4th created a subcategory of competitive cooking. These weren't the serious, sanctioned events of Memphis in May. They were hometown affairs, judged by mayors and high school principals, where the trophy mattered less than the bragging rights. Some food historians argue these local competitions did more to preserve regional variations than any formal organization. Weather services began issuing grilling forecasts for July 4th, predicting not just rain but optimal barbecue conditions. Insurance companies reported spike in claims, mostly minor burns and grass fires. Emergency rooms staffed up for barbecue injuries. The holiday had developed its own infrastructure, its own expectations, its own casualties. The organic food movement's intersection with July 4th barbecue created unexpected tensions. Grass-fed beef and heritage pork competed with traditional choices. Farmers' markets positioned themselves as patriotic alternatives to corporate meat. Some communities organized locavore July 4th events, attempting to reclaim independence through independent food sources, though whether the founders would recognize this as patriotism remains debatable. Women's evolving role in July 4th barbecue deserves particular attention. While men still dominated the grill in popular imagery, surveys showed women did most of the actual cooking. They planned menus, shopped, prepared sides, and increasingly managed the main event. The dad at the grill stereotype persisted in advertising even as reality had shifted. The environmental impact of millions of simultaneous barbecues began generating concern by the 2010s. Air quality measurements on July 4th showed significant spikes in particulate matter. Some cities considered restrictions, quickly abandoned when public outcry made clear that regulating July 4th barbecue was political suicide. Americans would tolerate many limitations, but not on their independence to create smoke. Social media transformed July 4th barbecue into performative patriotism. Instagram filled with staged grill photos, Facebook with competitive displays of elaborate spreads, Twitter with arguments about proper technique. The private backyard ritual had become public declaration, less about feeding family than broadcasting identity. By 2015, the July 4th barbecue had achieved something remarkable. It had become simultaneously universal and diverse, commercialized and authentic, traditional and constantly evolving. Nearly every American, regardless of origin, understood the ritual, even if they executed it differently. The smoke that rose from those 87 million grills carried different spices, different traditions, different meanings, but it rose together. The approaching 2020s would bring new challenges to this unanimous tradition. Pandemic restrictions, supply chain disruptions, political polarization that made even hamburgers controversial. But on that July 4th in 2015, as weather radar tracked the continental cloud of barbecue smoke, America was united in at least one thing: the belief that independence smelled like charcoal, tasted like sauce, sounded like sizzle. And maybe that consensus, manufactured though it might be, was worth something. Even as the definition of barbecue continued to expand and fragment, even as new technologies and techniques emerged, the basic human impulse to gather around fire and food remained constant, unchanging, eternal as smoke itself. You're watching a pitmaster in Austin, 2024, but something's different. She's monitoring her brisket's internal temperature through an app on her phone while live streaming the cook to thousands of followers. Her smoker, a $30,000 computer-controlled unit, adjusts airflow automatically, maintains perfect temperature without human intervention. Yet she still wakes at 3 a.m. to check the bark formation, still judges doneness by feel. This is modern barbecue, where silicon chips meet wood chips, where ancient techniques merge with space-age technology. The craft barbecue movement that emerged in the 2010s represents something unprecedented. Young pitmasters, many with no family tradition in barbecue, approaching smoke with scientific precision. They studied under established masters, yes, but also read food science textbooks, understood the Maillard reaction, could explain why smoke rings form at specific temperatures. Franklin Barbecue in Austin became the exemplar, where computer science dropout Aaron Franklin turned barbecue into obsessive art, creating brisket so transcendent that people waited 5 hours in line. What's fascinating about this period is how technology both enhanced and threatened traditional methods. Pellet grills promised set it and forget it convenience, but purists argued they produced inferior smoke. Wi-Fi-enabled thermometers allowed remote monitoring, but old-timers insisted you needed to be present with your meat. Smell the changes, hear the sizzle. The debate wasn't just about technique, it was about the soul of barbecue. The documentation happening right now is extraordinary. Every regional variation, every family recipe, every traditional technique is being recorded, uploaded, preserved in digital amber. YouTube channels with names like Mad Scientist Barbecue break down the chemistry of bark formation. Instagram accounts document disappearing barbecue joints before they close. TikTok spreads techniques that were once closely guarded secrets. We're living through the most thoroughly documented period in barbecue history. But here's what concerns thoughtful observers. This democratization of knowledge might be homogenizing what was once beautifully diverse. When everyone can access the same championship techniques, watch the same tutorials, buy the same equipment, regional distinctions blur. The Texas style that took centuries to develop can be replicated in Brooklyn. Carolina techniques executed in California. Is this preservation or dilution? The question remains contentious. The economics of modern craft barbecue create new paradoxes. Brisket that once was cheap because nobody wanted it now costs more per pound than prime rib. Restaurants charging $30 for what was once working class food. Lines of tourists at formerly local joints. Gentrification following smoke like it once followed redlining. Some historically black neighborhoods that gave birth to barbecue traditions can no longer afford their own cuisine. I'm amazed by the international explosion of American barbecue. Seoul has Texas-style joints run by Korean pitmasters who learned from YouTube. London hosts annual competitions judged by Kansas City rules. Melbourne has restaurants serving Carolina whole hog. But these aren't mere imitations, they're evolutions. Korean gochujang meeting Memphis dry rub. British ale-based sauces. Australian lamb prepared with Texas techniques. Barbecue has become a global language with countless dialects. The sustainability movement is forcing difficult questions about barbecue's future. Traditional smoking uses significant wood resources, produces substantial emissions, relies on meat production that some consider environmentally catastrophic. Yet barbecue culture is exploring alternatives. Mushroom brisket, jackfruit pulled pork, lab-grown meat experiments. Whether these preserve or pervert barbecue tradition depends on who you ask. Contemporary pitmasters include more women and people of color in visible positions than ever before, though still not proportionate to their historical contributions. Entrepreneurs like Helen Turner in Texas, Brian Furman in Atlanta, Mo Kaysen competing internationally. They're not just cooking traditional barbecue, they're expanding definitions, challenging assumptions, proving that authenticity isn't about replication but understanding principles. The pandemic years of 2020 to 2021 transformed barbecue in unexpected ways. Restaurants pivoted to takeout, losing the communal aspect central to barbecue culture. But home smoking exploded. Industry reports suggest sales of personal smokers increased by some estimates as much as 300%. Suburban neighbors formed bubble barbecues, sharing techniques across fences. The forced isolation somehow created new communities, united by smoke signals in an era of social distance. Food science continues advancing barbecue technology. Sous vide pre-processing, enzyme tenderizing, smoke infusion without combustion. Some restaurants now produce barbecue without any actual fire, using smoke extracts and precise temperature control. Traditionalists call it heresy. Modernists call it evolution. The argument reflects deeper questions about authenticity in an age of simulation. The preservation efforts happening now are crucial. Organizations document traditional pitmasters before they pass. Archaeological projects excavate historic barbecue sites. Oral history projects record techniques never written down. There's an urgency to this work, a recognition that globalization and commercialization threaten knowledge maintained for generations. Climate change is already affecting barbecue. Droughts limit wood availability. Changing weather patterns affect outdoor cooking seasons. Rising meat prices force menu adaptations. Some regions that define themselves through specific wood types face forests decimated by beetles and disease. The future of regional barbecue might depend on environmental factors beyond anyone's control. Cultural appropriation debates surrounding barbecue grow more complex. When does appreciation become appropriation? Can techniques developed through slavery be freely commercialized? Who owns traditions that emerged from cultural fusion? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary, forcing recognition of histories often obscured by smoke. Yet despite every challenge, every change, every technological disruption, something endures. People still gather around smoke and fire, still wait patiently for meat to transform, still argue passionately about sauce and technique. The tools might be different, the science better understood, the audience global rather than local, but the essential human impulse remains. Looking forward from 2024, barbecue faces unprecedented challenges and opportunities. It must adapt to environmental pressures while preserving traditional methods, embrace technology without losing soul, expand globally while maintaining regional identity, include everyone while honoring those who created it. These aren't easy balances, but barbecue has always been about patience, about transformation through time, about making something transcendent from humble ingredients. The smoke that rises from modern pits carries more than flavor now. It carries history, culture, conflict, and hope. It connects us to ancestors who discovered that fire plus time equals community. It reminds us that some things can't be rushed, can't be automated, can't be reduced to algorithms. And as long as people are willing to wake before dawn, tend fires through the day, and share the results with others, barbecue will endure, evolve, and continue telling the story of who we are, one perfectly smoked bite at a time. And here we are at the end of our smoky journey through time. You've traveled from Caribbean beaches where the Taíno first suspended meat over smoldering fires, through colonial gatherings where 3 continents merged their traditions, across the painful history of enslaved pitmasters who transformed survival into art. Witness the suburban revolution, driven the interstate highways, felt the competitive fire of championships, and glimpsed the future where tradition and technology dance together in the smoke. The story of barbecue. It's really the story of America itself, isn't it? all the contradictions, all the beauty and pain, mixed together and transformed by time and heat into something that somehow works. Something born from necessity that became celebration. Let your breathing slow now, matching the patient rhythm of smoke rising from ancient fires. Those Taíno cooks from 5 centuries ago, they discovered something essential, that waiting can be sacred, that transformation takes time, that the best things can't be rushed. The same principle that governs perfect barbecue governs perfect rest, low and slow, patient and gentle. Picture the smoke from all those pits across centuries, rising and mingling in the air above. Caribbean smoke mixing with Carolina, Texas blending with Korean, past connecting with present. It all rises together, all becomes part of the same sky, the same endless dance between fire and time. Your thoughts might be drifting now, like smoke itself, wandering through memories of barbecues past, the smell of charcoal from childhood summers, the taste of that perfect bite you've never forgotten. These memories are part of the tradition too, your small contribution to the great river of smoke that flows through American history. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, like meat slowly surrendering to smoke, releasing the day's tensions. The ancient rhythm of barbecue is the rhythm of rest, the patience of waiting, the trust that time will transform everything. You don't need to do anything now, just let the process work. All those regional differences we traced, they matter deeply to the people who maintain them. But from this drowsy distance, they're all just variations on the same theme, humanity's ancient conversation with fire, our persistent belief that patience creates magic. Your eyelids might be feeling heavy now, weighted with the warmth of all those fires, all those stories. Let them close if they want to. There is nothing you need to tend. The fire is banked, the temperature steady, everything is exactly as it should be. Tomorrow the smoke will rise again from professional pits and backyard grills. People will continue the argument about sauce and no sauce, wood and charcoal. These arguments are part of the tradition too. But tonight, in this quiet moment, all those arguments fade into the background hum of history. Your breathing is probably matching the slow rise of smoke now, in and out, gentle and easy, carrying you towards sleep the way smoke carries flavor into meat, gradually, thoroughly, inevitably. The smoke is clearing now, dissipating into the night air, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence, a memory more than a smell. And you're floating with it, drifting into dreams that might taste of summer, smell of hickory. Rest now, like meat resting after its long cook. The story is told, the fire is dying to embers. Everything is finished, everything is perfect, everything is ready for dreams. Close your eyes completely now and drift, like the last wisps of smoke into the summer night, carrying the warmth of countless fires tended by countless hands across countless years, all leading to this moment, this rest, this peace.